begin with, could I introduce, please, Brian Paddick? If you could introduce yourself, tell us a bit about yourself, and then perhaps give us your outline of what you see as the problems we have had in the last 50 years of the Misuse of Drugs Act.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming along. So policing, I was a police officer for over 30 years. Prohibition, well, sort of my unilateral action against prohibition was when I was the commander in Lambeth in South London, 2001. I suggested that we didn't arrest people for small amounts of cannabis. After a bit of toing and froing, the commissioner agreed to do a year-long pilot where we didn't arrest anybody for possession of cannabis. I then left the police after being a bit too radical for them and ran for Mayor of London in 2008 and 2012. You may have noticed that I didn't win either of those elections, but in 2013, having given up on the idea of elections, I was elevated, as they call it, to the House of Lords, where you don't need to be to win any elections to go in. So that's where I am now. And I speak in the House of Lords on home affairs. So the problem, as I see it, are three separate but related issues around misuse of drugs: recreational use, addiction, and supply. So in my view, I believe that many illegal drugs can be used safely and responsibly in a similar way to alcohol. What makes most drugs unsafe is the lack of regulation and quality control, and the lack of education in terms of telling particularly young people what the risks are of taking these substances and what the effects are on if you take them. Addiction is a separate issue. It's a health issue. That applies equally to legal drugs such as alcohol and nicotine, and other addictive behaviours such as gambling, pornography, and sex. Now, I understand that there are other arguments against pornography around abuse of women and so forth, but that's not my point here. My point here is exclusively with drugs, the approach is to criminalise users and addicts rather than treat it as a health issue, which of course is what actually should be done. So the answer to the first sort of two of those issues is decriminalisation, which has to some extent been achieved with cannabis. I may or may not have had a hand in that, but now you can have a small amount of cannabis for personal use. And if you're caught by the police, you can be just given a warning on the street and the cannabis is taken off you. Or you can be given a fixed penalty notice without getting a criminal record. So before the cannabis pilot in Lambeth, the police had no choice apart from very rare circumstances, like a foreign national in the departure lounge of an airport was one of the examples that was given, where the police had no option. If you were found in possession of drugs, you had to be arrested. But now you could be issued with a warning or a fixed penalty notice and not get a criminal record. And you can be given a warning at the police station even after you've been arrested. Also, in relation to new psychoactive substances, what used to be called legal highs, possession went from being legal highs, to illegal under the new Psychoactive Substances Act. But, or should I say, for drugs, new psychoactive substances, which they decided were so dangerous they needed to be controlled under the Misuse of Drugs Act. But now the law is, under the Psychoactive Substances Act, that possession of a small amount of new psychoactive substance that is not controlled under the Misuse of Drugs Act for personal use is legal. It's just the manufacture and supply that is illegal. So there's been some move along the path of decriminalisation in specific limited circumstances. The issue with supply can only be dealt with by legalizing. And whilst supply remains illegal, whether we're talking about new psychoactive substances or controlled substances, the issues around gang violence, exploitation of young people through county lines, drug deaths caused by faulty manufacture, failure to secure urgent medical attention for fear of being criminalized, and restricting use by those under 18, those problems remain unless we go the whole hog and legalize. So my priorities would be, rather than just say no, to use a very old and hackneyed phrase that was used in America for a while around the war on drugs, children and young people need to be educated about the dangers of drugs, legal and illegal, but also what they actually do to you, what the risks are, so they can make an educated decision around it. And the way that we change things, unfortunately, my experience of politics, I hate politics, by the way, I'm in the wrong job, I think. Politicians tend to follow public opinion rather than the science. And therefore, the way forward is to change public opinion, because if an increasing majority of the public are in favor of decriminalisation or legalisation of drugs, then politicians and the law will follow. And that's all I was going to say to begin with anyway.
Perfect. Thank you very, very much, Brian. I could see Niamh and Jason were faithfully scribbling down notes there, so many of your points will be returned to later, I'm absolutely sure. One extra, there was a little bit of my introduction was a bit too brief at the beginning. So one thing I forgot to say is that we really, really welcome comments and questions posted into the chat and through question functions from the guests, and we will hopefully have some time to put some of those questions to the panelists later. So do put your thoughts, comments and questions in there. Next, we will lead on to an opening gambit from Jason Kew. So once again, if you could please let us know about who you are, what you do, what you have done, and I believe you will be leading also onto some things, very impressive things you have been doing at the moment to see in ways that you can improve the situation, perhaps try and work with and around some of the issues that Brian had just been talking to us about.
Thank you. Firstly, it's a real privilege to be here. Thank you so much. It is absolutely a highlight of my career to be on the same panel as Brian and Niamh. So thank you very much for having me. I'm a serving police officer, so I have a platform, if you like, or an ability to create a small amount of change and influence policy to an extent where we can actually implement diversion schemes, or other schemes to deal with people found in possession of drugs, and rapidly turn what would have been an incriminating encounter into a health outcome, into a positive health outcome. So we can do stuff now within the legal framework. Within Thames Valley Police, my area, we have developed a drug diversion scheme. And as Mr. Paddick mentioned, addiction is a real factor here. Addiction is purely a health matter, but it's only a very small number of people who are in addiction, and actually the bulk of drug use is recreational. So again, agreeing completely with Mr. Paddick, we need to be able to find a policy or a mechanism, so when someone is found in possession of drugs by the police, to enable an assessment, but also offer education. And that's how I feel personally, possibly, is the role of the state. So police and public health have a duty, if you like, to reduce harm. We do have the highest drug-related death rate on record. That's nothing to be proud of, but we really need to voice that. And in fact, we have a third of all drug-related deaths in Europe, and that's a significant number. So we really, I'm not conflating the issue here, but we have a problem. And we have a problem in perhaps with stigma. and Prohibition has a responsibility towards increasing stigma. So we rapidly need to find a way where we can enable that rapid assessment, if you like, of someone in a destigmatized, non-judgmental way. So within Thames Valley Police, we utilise for young people a community resolution. Now that's a golden nugget, a gem of legislation, which negates the need for an arrest, precludes the need for an interview, and doesn't require an admission of guilt. And it was actually Thames Valley Police Drug Diversion Scheme, along with West Midlands, was cited in the race report recently as under recommendation 12, but for Class B. But we include all substances, Class A included. The route is the same regardless if anyone has previous convictions. Everybody is enabled to go down this pathway towards an assessment and education. And it's not the police doing this. The police spend what would be 10 to 15 minutes. In fact, similar to the model that Mr. Paddick described in Brixton. We treat the issue as a health issue first and foremost. Our partners in our drug services are the experts about drugs, not the police. You know, we're enforcers, if you like. We are seen as enforcers. We are seen as prosecutors. We cannot be responsible for trying to manage an idealistic policy, if that makes sense, into deterring drug use. And that's why Prohibition exists. The Prohibition exists to deter people from using drugs. So to that effect, we have to then recognise the fact, well, how effective is Prohibition actually? You know, I'm not being controversial here, but we have to critically assess current policy. And if 11% of adults in the UK have consumed a controlled drug in the past year, Prohibition isn't having a great effect at deterring people from using drugs. And if 20% of 16 to 24-year-olds have consumed a controlled drug in the past year, that's 1.3 million young people. That's 1.3 million young people in our riskiest age bracket. And none of those are being afforded in the traditional, in the existing pathway, an assessment or education about their drug use. And it's exactly as Mr. Paddick describes. It's our role is to enable someone an assessment and education, but we shouldn't limit this to one opportunity either. So within the Thames Valley Police Scheme, we have unlimited opportunities so that a person can basically, when they're found again and again and again, if necessary, as long as they're engaging positively, to enable a tailored educational or harm reduction intervention at the drug service, not at the police station. And you might wonder, if there's no arrest, no interview, and there's no I don't know what the word is actually, coercion, if you like, to get someone to the drug service, then how many people attend? And we're finding that 88% of young people voluntarily attend the drug service, and half of those want to stay on beyond the normal 6-week 1-hour sessions. So they want to stay on beyond and learn far more about the drugs they've been found with, because it might be the cannabis that a young person's been found with, but actually the risk lies with the ketamine use at the weekend. So police are a gateway, yes, but in partnership with public health. And that's where we then honour that duty of the state to reduce harm. For adults, we have a similar scheme. It's a deferred summons approach, very similar to Bristol, Avon and Somerset's model, but we have unlimited opportunities, and again, a voluntary interview on the street. So the police station's not involved in this process at all. We want to rapidly turn that, previously incriminating encounter into a positive health outcome there and then on the street. And we have 95% of adults completing that course too. So it's completely effective. It just proves to say that you do not need to bring someone into a police station. And if we need to change public opinion, we need to describe these schemes and their effectiveness, but also case studies. And I'll just mention 2 very brief case studies now. We diverted a 19-year-old found with crystal meth, which he bought online. First drug, no knowledge of other drugs, no trace to any, not known to the police or drug services. The drug service made contact with him on that day, and there was a dual diagnosis with mental health as well, because it's quite unusual. And we found that the issues were underlying. They were more mental health orientated from a pressure point. I'm not going to disclose too much because for fear of identifying him, but it was a university issue going on beneath his use. So it wasn't actually the drug use. The drug use was a medication, if you like, to an underlying symptom of mental health. And had that individual gone through the previous channel of being arrested, going to a police cell, bailed or released under investigation for analysis, if you like, that would have taken about a month, come back, received a caution or a charge and a 50 quid fine, then that 19-year-old would have had far more to worry about, possibly, and obviously not touching the issues about his drug use or mental health. So diversion really does work. And again, for young people, we've had parents writing in praising this scheme because their children are not now lumbered with a criminal sanction, and they're able to fulfill their hopes and dreams in America with scholarships and so on and so on and so on. So there's a lot that we can do in the current legal framework, and that's depenalisation. We can call it de facto decriminalisation, but we shouldn't. Policymakers, those in positions of responsibility or able to create change, shouldn't shy away from these terms called decriminalisation. Our diversion scheme now is, I'm not going to ramble on too long, I'm going to steal the show, but our diversion scheme now is being adopted by schools to preclude the need for exclusion. So there are many aspects, police are the gateway, if you like. We have a model that can be adopted by the education sector to solve or to part solve another issue of finding students in possession of drugs or drug use situations. And the drug service take over that issue. Again, the diversion framework can be used for a number of other state-based crimes like sex work. Why on earth are women arrested for soliciting? Why does that happen? The state has a duty to ensure that they're safe and well, not to be criminalized, not to be fined for 50 quid, which is going to have a far more damaging effect later on. So there are a lot more trauma-informed approaches that we can make. Details of these schemes that I've just been describing, because I saw a question flash up, they're on the Thames Valley Violence Reduction Unit website. We're happy to share those. But that's my piece for now. There's lots that we can do, and there's lots that we must do. Drug-related deaths are a real fact, and the fact is that the UK has record numbers of drug-related deaths.
Thank you very, very much for that, Jason. Very, very interesting. One thing that was really sticking in my mind there is all of the schemes you just described in the Thames Valley area sounded absolutely wonderful. And something maybe I would be interested to hear as well from Niamh and Brian later on is, what do you think of a situation where the sort of diversion provision which you might benefit from is something of a postcode lottery? If you're lucky enough that Jason Kew, your local chief inspector, well, lucky you. What do we think about the situation where you might live over the border, not in the Thames Valley, and you do not get to benefit from that? So I think that's something we might bring in later. But for now, we haven't let Niamh have a go. So please, Niamh Eastwood, could you please introduce yourself? And I think you were going to say a bit more about some of the potential solutions, but please do add anything, and of course, any comments you might have on what we've already heard from Brian and Jason so far.
Thank you, James, and it's a pleasure to be here for the second time on the Streets Drugs discussion. I think it's interesting to me that it's 50 years of the Misuse of Drugs Act this year. So it was established in 1971. Release was established in 1967. So we're just 4 years older than the Act. I wasn't there at the time, but I mean, there's a lot of shared history in kind of the Prohibition and Release's kind of journey. And the organization was set up largely in response to the way that the police in West London were responding to local communities. So people who, there was a big countercultural movement in the area, but also a lot of migration from the West Indies. And the cannabis laws in particular were being used to stop and search people for drugs. And I think Brian is absolutely right that, you know, the prohibition is keenly felt by people who are drug dependent. Also too, I mean, we have to recognize that lots of people use recreational drugs, but also too, the use of these laws are also a way of stopping and searching certain groups in society. And so back in 1967 and through the 70s, it was very much used as a target for the Black community. And again, today, we still see those racial inequities when we see the application of these laws and the application of the powers associated with these laws. And so the work that we've done at the organization most recently is to really analyze the level of stop and search. And this is important because, you know, lots of times when we talk about stop and search discussions, it will get sort of siloed into knife crime. But when we look at the use of stop and search, it is predominantly for drugs stop and searches. So 60% of all searches last year were for drugs. And Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary clearly states that about 70% of those searches are for possession only. So this is not about tackling the supply trade. And it's important to remember that 4 in 5 result in no drugs being found. And the research that we did showed that Black people were 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched for drugs, despite using drugs at a lower rate than the white population. So the racial inequity is one of the problems that I think has historically been centered in drug law prohibition. And that's not just in the UK, that's across the globe. Jason has already highlighted the public health harms, the fact that we have the highest rate of drug-related deaths on record, but also to the fact that it's been highest on record for the last 8 years. I mean, that is an absolute travesty and a real example of why, of a public health failure in this area and a lack of political drive, political care from government to address this. And again, going back to what Jason said about the failure of the approach, you mean, this does not deter drug use. Since the Act was initiated in 1971, the drug use has just increased and increased and increased. And in fact, the government's own research shows that this is a failed policy. So there's a lovely piece of research that was published in 2017 by the Home Office alongside the amended strategy, the updated strategy, which looked at the effectiveness of the 2010 drug strategy. And Chapter 5 deals with law enforcement. And it says that we in the UK spend 1.6 billion a year on drug law enforcement, and that it has little to no impact on the drugs market. And it describes the drugs market as resilient. And it goes on to list the harms associated with prohibition. So the impact on employment, the impact on families, the distrust that is caused with communities and police in the use of these laws. So I think, you know, the fact that Jason and others across the country, and there's 5 police forces now implementing pre-arrest diversion schemes, that policy development is occurring in the absence of political leadership. So it's the police forces that are implementing these diversion policies that are actually driving reform at the moment. And that's an abdication of responsibility by government. And the diversion schemes are really a way of establishing evidence for decriminalisation, I think. So, you know, I know some of the early findings from Durham, and Jason, you're finding this in Thames Valley, and there's work that will be done in West Midlands, have looked at the impact on things like health outcomes for people diverted, both physical and mental health, have looked at things like recidivism, have looked at social outcomes, and across the board, they have found that those outcomes are much more improved around health and social than they are when we compare it to criminal justice outcomes. And also too, that rates of reoffending reduce. And that's really important because We know that for many, many young people, their first contact with the criminal justice system is in fact through drug possession policing. And if they are found in possession, they enter the criminal justice system and that revolving door starts to occur. And so if you like, possession policing is a gateway into the criminal justice system. And the diversion schemes and decriminalisation are a way of stopping that gate, blocking that gate. And that really, the outcomes that we're seeing in the UK police forces are really reflective of some of the experience in countries across the world that have adopted a decriminalisation approach. And when we talk about decriminalisation, we shouldn't conflate it with legalisation, although I agree with Brian that we need to explore legalisation. But decriminalisation very much reflects the diversion schemes. It is a non-criminal justice response to possession of drugs. And there are 29 countries across the globe that have taken this approach. Of them, the majority have applied it to all controlled drugs. This is not about cannabis. There are also a further 20 states in the US and in Australia that have decriminalized cannabis. And it'd be really interesting to talk about the cannabis legalization models maybe later in the conversation. But some of the studies, and Portugal is trotted out regularly because it is the best researched model. But they implemented their model in 2001, decriminalized possession of all drugs. They get people referred to a dissuasion committee to discuss their drug use, very much like Jason's diversion scheme. Worth noting, 86% of cases diverted are suspended, so there's no further action, there's no requirement to do anything. And their drug-related death is about 11 times lower than the UK's. And they've a list of other public health outcomes and social outcomes that are very positive. The Czech Republic decriminalized in 2010. And again, their drug-related deaths are about 10 times lower than the UK, maybe actually 13 times lower than the UK. Same for Portugal. Sorry, my maths there. I was trying to do the maths in my head. And across Europe, countries like the Netherlands, Germany, Spain, Italy, all have decriminalized in some form or another. All have lower rates of drug-related death than the EU average, which is 22 per million of the population, compared to the UK, which is 74 to 76 per million of the population. And I'm not saying decriminalization is the silver bullet in addressing drug-related deaths, but it shows that the adoption of that policy can contribute to good public health outcomes. So that's really important, I think, when we talk about decriminalization. We also have a lot of learning from other models that are occurring in the US. As I said, we can discuss cannabis regulation, but I'm really interested this week in the announcement by the Baltimore prosecutors, who a year ago, because of COVID, decided to stop prosecuting all low-level drug offenses and other offenses such as sex work, such as traffic violations, largely with the aim of reducing the prison population locally in the jails there because of the COVID risks. A year on, they have decided to make that a permanent policy. And that is because of the outcomes associated with it. So they are not policing these activities at all. They have removed police and prosecutors from drugs. And what they have found, and I'm just going to read the stats that were in the press release this week, is that there was a 39% decrease in people entering the criminal justice system between March and December last year. Violent crime was down by 20%. So the decision not to prosecute and police these low-level offenses is actually impacting on other types of crime. And property crime is down by a third. There was lots of concerns the public wouldn't like this, but in fact, the number of calls from the public is down by a third referring to drugs. So this is something that I think is really worth exploring, this idea of shifting police away from these low-level offenses and really focusing in on where we can have better outcomes from criminal justice policy. So yes, And I think one of the things that they said in the press release, that there was no public safety there was no public safety outcomes associated with policing these low-level offences. And I think that's really important, kind of thinking about public safety and community safety, and actually counterintuitively maybe that the policing of these offences is contributing to a diminishment in public safety and community safety. So that's all I've got to say at the minute.
Awesome. Thank you, Niamh. There's actually a couple of questions which are kind of quick clarifications of what you had said. So from James Richards, do these countries have as large a percentage of drug users as the UK, or do they have 11 times less? I would think that refers to a stat you gave on Portugal. I think it was deaths per capita. Is that clarification correct?
Yeah, that's right. So the rates that I shared, so at the minute, Portugal and Czech Republic have a death rate of 4 per million of the population. And the UK is 76 per million of the population. And because we're doing pro rata, it's not about the level of drug use.
Great, thank you. And another quick hit is from Caroline Mail, who says, could she ask you for the name of the Home Office document that you referred to a few minutes ago?
Yeah, so it's the Drug Strategy Evaluation 2017. And it's on the same page as the Drug Strategy 2017. And it's chapter 5.
I'll put that in the chat too. Right, and one thing I will add to that in some shameless self-promotion is you mentioned some of the global schemes for decriminalising legalisation around the world. And one of our more recent webinars, we had a lot about Uruguay. We had, and social clubs, we had Mafalda Pardal from University of Ghent, and we had Marcos Bodin from the Cannabis Observatory of Uruguay. So I will take the liberty of posting in the link to our YouTube channel. So we'll talk about that later for sure, but people can also click the link and then we've got an hour and a half of that stuff from Mafalda and Marcos, but I will definitely be returning to that topic later. But at this point, I think I will complete the circle and return to Brian. So Brian, I don't know if you've got some of your own immediate follow-up thoughts on that or anything else prepared as a kind of logical follow-up from that. I was one for, to pick out another quote from Niamh that I found very interesting, was the idea of the politicians, something responsibility. I can't remember what exactly he said. The politicians not taking responsibility for the appropriate policy changes. So I wondered if you had a view on that, perhaps connecting with the idea that we often have policing-led reform, perhaps rather than politician-led reform, and where you think the balance currently is, perhaps where you think the balance should be. So from any of those points or none of those points, if you've got better ones, back over to you, Brian.
Thanks very much. I mean, the trouble is politicians feel that decriminalisation / legalisation of drugs is not going to be popular with the electorate, that it's going to lose them votes. And you can see that when we had the psychoactive substances bill being debated in the House of Lords, for example. I suggested that for consistency, as new psychoactive substances possession for personal use was not going to be illegal, that we should legalise all possession of drugs, and both the majority. I'm trying to stay non-party political. The majority of the House of Lords voted overwhelmingly against the idea of decriminalising drugs for personal possession. So that is it, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. In that, it is not just about a majority of the public. The way politicians look at it is, would the majority of people who vote for our party support this? Therefore, it's not simply, because one party that you could think of might think that the majority of their voters would be in favour of decriminalisation or legalisation, whereas Other parties, more than one party might think that, but other parties would think, no, this is going to lose us votes, and therefore we're going to lose power, and so forth. That's what it's all about. It's nothing really to do with what are the consequences in terms of the number of people dying, what is the best harm reduction outcome. Regrettably, where politicians predominantly are, how many votes will this be popular amongst our supporters, and therefore will this gain us or lose us votes? And that is the ridiculous situation that we're in, which is why we have to bypass the politicians and go directly to the public. And you know, there have been interesting changes or apparent changes in editorial position with some of the tabloids, for example. There's been some sympathetic pieces in the Daily Mail, would you believe? So, you know, that's the route that we have to go down, because as soon as political parties believe that advocating decriminalisation, a harm reduction approach, treating drug use as a medical issue rather than a law enforcement issue, as soon as we get to the position where parties believe that that will win them votes, then they will adopt it as a policy and we will get the law changed. In the meantime, those people who don't have to worry too much about that, i.e. chief constables who have a supportive police and crime commissioner, because at the end of the day, a chief constable these days is going to be very reluctant to change policy if they think it's going to result in them being sacked by their police and crime commissioner. And most police and crime commissioners, regrettably, now are party affiliated. So where the stars align and you get a progressive chief constable, a progressive police and crime commissioner, you get pre-arrest diversion. And the more of these that we have, and the more the evidence is supportive that this is the right way to go, the better chance we have, and publicising that, the more chance we have of getting the public on side, and politicians will follow. Regrettably, cynically, that's where we are.
Great, thank you very much for that, Brian. I think I'll keep things circular again and move to Jason. I've actually, Jason, got a quick hit question for you from Samantha Clark. How long did it take you to get the decriminalisation embedded? And also, did you round legal as this is a bit of a stumbling block for us?
Succinctly, it was very straightforward because it utilises what is available to police already. You know, yes, we did explore the red lines of the MOJ guidance around out of court disposals as part of our evaluation and pilot, but that's where the evidence base is fed back into the evidence base for for other policies, and to share the process out. But this the diversion scheme isn't political. And in fact, the fusion of police and health leading a diversion scheme depoliticizes this very politically prickly subject of drugs. So diversion, and it's probably just following a thread through here, decriminalisation or diversion or depenalisation is a way to destigmatise possession of drugs. So what that does is it enables the idea, the aim, if you like, is I want someone who is in their front room, who previously feared losing their children to social care, or previously feared losing their job, or previously feared by speaking out about problematic use, getting a sack or being caught by police. We don't want those people to fear a punitive response for seeking help. And this is where diversion decriminalisation comes into its own, because it's to make a safe passage, if you like, for someone to seek help and recovery and support when they need it. Regulation is a way to disrupt organised crime. Now, I haven't got the brain power to know how regulation works, or what model might work. I've certainly seen great examples, especially in Massachusetts, where there's a social equity program about re-employing ex-offenders into the state cannabis supply system, and now paying tax and contributing to society. That's amazing. Could that work here? I would sincerely hope so. And it's these are the big questions that, you know, academics, health partners, policymakers, where you're cleverer than me, can really help to remodel. And that's a way to significantly reduce organised crime. So there are different aspects here of, you know, decriminalisation for possession, because that destigmatizes a pathway to recovery and support, but a way to reduce drug use, to reduce organised crime, is a way of regulation. Now, heroin-assisted treatment is something that we can champion here and now. It's within our ability now. Cleveland, as an example, have a heroin-assisted treatment program, so that's injectable diamorphine, as part of the range of treatment options for opiate substitution. And originally 12 people who were disengaged from services were embarked on that treatment program and enabled with injectable diamorphine within the drug service. And they previously, between them, just 12 people committed 887 crimes before the program. After 3 months, after just 3 months, that crime rate dropped from 887 crimes down to 10. Now, from a policing lens, purely a policing lens, that is remarkable. You know, what police chief or police area would not be proud and chomping at the bit, if you like, to get heroin-assisted treatment embedded within their local area? But these things cost money, they cost investment, and this is where we need to reorganize, reframe budgets to show that actually we need to really reconsider how we can best take a health-based approach to tackling and disrupting serious and organised crime. And heroin-assisted treatment truly works. Another golden gateway here, and this is not my own bandwagon, but I strongly advocate drug consumption rooms because they are an epicenter of support and social capital when the person needs it the most. They aren't going soft on drugs. There's nothing soft about preventing death. These centres are open when someone, you know, marginalised and vulnerable, needs the service the most. And it's a golden gateway to access other forms of treatment policies as well. We need to move forwards with this conversation. You know, we're not being radical here. We're not being controversial. We're speaking the truth. You know, this is evidence. This is policy. It works elsewhere. We need to explore it here. And I'm very proud to be amongst many working groups, expert groups, working on exactly these things. So for me, we perhaps shouldn't get clouded about the conversation around legalizing cannabis. Let's start with heroin, because that's a surefire way to reduce harm much quicker, in my opinion.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very, very much. I don't know, and actually, I'm actually going to turn the circle round a little bit, because later I've got a question which I think will be best to go straight to Niamh, which is kind of taking it in a different direction. So I wonder if we can go back to Brian and talk more about perhaps the change we can hope for the future and the roadblocks for it. And also I wonder if you could perhaps start with that on, since you are the one in politics, just say something about how devolution works with regards to drug policy, since we had one kind of quite specific or factual question about differences between Scotland and England. I'm just looking for that question again. Don't know if anyone can find it. Where's it gone? But yeah, if you could tell us what you expect change to come, how it might come, and perhaps the roadblocks in terms of domestic change that you think there might be for us.
I think I might have at least hinted at what the roadblocks might be. And we've seen recently, for example, in the London mayoral race, Sadiq Khan saying that he's going to commission a report if he's re-elected into legalization of cannabis, prompting a response from Number 10 saying he doesn't have the power to legalize cannabis, which of course he doesn't. And there is no way that this government is going to go anywhere near that. So that gives you a flavour of where we are as far as that sort of change is concerned. So it is about highlighting the benefits of decriminalisation. So as Jason has just said, people who are addicted to heroin, for example, are desperate to get a fix. If there is no legal way that they can source heroin or any sort of treatment to help them off heroin, then they will commit crime in order to get the money in order to pay for it. Of course, in any of this decriminalisation stuff, we're not talking about decriminalising crimes that are acquisitive crimes that are committed by people who are using drugs, people who resort to crime in order to feed their habit. We're talking about decriminalisation of possession, turning it into a health issue, and particularly with people who are addicted, enabling them to legally source the drugs that they need in order to prevent them from committing the sorts of crime that Jason referred to. So, it is through, as I keep saying, it is through changing public opinion, through highlighting the advantages of decriminalisation, highlighting not only in terms of the benefits for the individual concerned in terms of taking a health approach and an education approach and so forth, but also the benefit to wider society in the reduction in acquisitive crime as a consequence. I am slightly concerned, bearing in mind the Number 10 reaction this week to Sadiq Khan's suggestion, is that there could be, as we've seen with other issues, a backlash where right-wing politicians who are blissfully unaware of all this fantastic, innovative stuff going on around pre-arrest diversion, complain that these things should be stopped. Particularly the prescribing of heroin, for example, and that in the current political situation that we have, that things could potentially go into reverse. So that's only a slight concern that I have around that particular issue. But, it's about convincing the public, convincing the voters of the benefits, and they go wider than the ones that have been mentioned. People have mentioned in the question and answer about, and Niamh mentioned it, about the racist aspect of stop and search, the fact that it is targeted on young black men. And I remember talking to a tall, blonde, and he hadn't dyed his hair, 19-year-old who had been at public school near Brixton. And every weekend while he was at that school, he went into Brixton and bought cannabis, but was never once stopped and searched by the police because he was white. And, we can't get away from the fact that you are 8-9 times more likely to be stopped and searched if you're black than if you're white. The benefits in terms of legalizing or decriminalizing possession of small amounts of drugs takes away the reason for the police to be targeting people to search them for drugs, and could have enormous beneficial impact in terms of, as I try to do in Brixton, I have to tell people here, I'm currently under quarantine, and I now need to answer the government who phone me every day to make sure that I'll come back to you.
No, thank you. So in fact, I will then move to Niamh for the question which I had prepared, which I actually need to find again. It's from Felipe. Where is the question? From Filippo Nace Arajo. So thank you, Felipe, for saying you see this as a brilliant discussion. And his question to Niamh: how can we ensure that the process of legalization goes hand in hand with policies aimed to redress the harms caused to individuals, families, and communities by decades of a racist war on drugs? Could you take that on, Niamh?
Of course I could. And just to reiterate what Brian just said, I think we really have to kind of separate out kind of the idea that, because I saw a question about the idea that drug legislation prevents drug use. It really doesn't, given that I think that's well evidenced. And all of the countries that have adopted a decriminalisation model have not seen a significant increase in drugs. But I also would argue that our drug policies should not be measured in terms of success on the levels of use, but actually in the reductions of harm. And one of the greatest harms of our drug policies, as I highlighted in my opening remarks, is this racist nature of it. The fact that it is specific communities who are targeted by police, and that is about social control. And the research that we've done has shown that in areas of deprivation, you see high levels of policing. I know Jason has spoken about the visible nature of crime, but that's again what we define as crime. So the fact that we define drug use as a crime means it is much more associated with a visible activity in deprived areas, because people don't have the space to use drugs in the way that they do in affluent areas. So, I think it's really important that we challenge the notion that drug policy and drug prohibition is about preventing drug use. It's not just about that. And if we look at kind of responses to policy development that has sought to really center itself around reparations for the harms of drug policies in the US, there's a lot of learning going on there. And I think it's interesting learning. When the US states started to legalize drugs back in 2014, is it 2014? Yeah, 2012. I think none of us really expected there to be principles of social equity or inclusivity and diversion within a regulated cannabis model in a US state. This is the ground zero for the drug war, and two, one of the most commercialized countries in the world. It's very much kind of driven by capitalist principles. But in fact, cannabis has been a real sort of beacon in developing policies that seek to provide opportunities for those who have been traditionally in the market. And it's very much centered, as I said, on an idea of reparations, that the war on drugs in the US has been felt most keenly by people of color, so the Hispanic community and the African American community, and that therefore any step to reforms must be centered in a response that supports those communities. And so I think there's probably about 16 states have now legalized cannabis. 6 states have at their core social equity principles. And what that means is that when cannabis is legalized, there is an expungement of records. So criminal records, everyone who has a criminal record for a cannabis-related offense has that record extinguished, which is right considering the racial disparities. That there are opportunities for people to transition from the illicit market into the illicit market into the licit market. So that's done through financial support, technical support, prioritization of licenses. There is also, and I think this is fundamentally important, is that often decriminalization and legalization are set up as competing models, whereas in fact they are complementary models that must work hand in hand. So in all US states that have a cannabis legalized regulation model, possession of cannabis, regardless of where it comes from, so whether it's from the legal market or illegal market, because the illegal market still exists, it's going to take time, that is not a criminal offence. It is legal to possess a certain quantity of cannabis, regardless of where its kind of where its origin comes from. That is unlike Canada, which legalized cannabis, which did not have any social equity, which did not have any expungement of records, and which still to this day criminalizes possession of cannabis for that comes from the illicit market. So it continues that policy, in my view, to throw the people who were thrown under the bus of prohibition, under the bus of the new type of prohibition, under a cannabis regulated model, if that makes sense. So, you know, there are ways that policy can address these harms. My organization is going to be publishing a paper in the next month or two, which is going to look at these different models. I think what we want to do is bring together organizations across the country, both civil society, political parties, leaders in this area, Black community groups, to say these are our red lines for cannabis regulation. And I know I'm going on, but I just want to pick up on a point that Brian made about number 10 statement in response to the Mayor's Cannabis Commission. I'm not sure if that's politics playing out because we're just in the middle of an election, if I'm honest, and whether number 10 may take a different position in a few months' time. There is a lot of money in the cannabis industry at the minute. There is a lot of lobbying going on from companies. And that, you know, that is, and the fact that we have so many states in the US that have legalized, that is going to influence this government, I think. And that being said, we all need to get our red lines together from those who are working to make sure that this policy will benefit those communities. And I think from a policing perspective, that's really important because there's lots of deprived communities who are dependent on the drugs trade. There is lots of harms in the drugs trade, but there's lots of deprived communities who use it as a form of income. And ideally, what you want is to transition people out of the illicit market into the legal market. So I think this is really important from a policing perspective as well.
Thank you very much, Niamh. So I think we'll go back to Jason now. I've actually got two quite very different questions. So one is, just to follow up from Niamh there. So I think the last was the suggestion of diverting people away from relying on the drug trade, and which is kind of different to your diversions from people who are using drugs. So I don't know if you've got anything from that to build onto Niamh's points there.
Yeah, I think, could you just re-ask your question again? Sorry, I was going off at another, in my head, I was going off one train of thought, just going to answer it properly. Sorry, James.
It's that Niamh had mentioned that some communities might be disproportionately reliant on the illicit drugs economy. And do you think there are ways you should suggest, or any thoughts on the idea of how to divert people away from relying on money from being involved in the drugs economy?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned the Massachusetts, social equity program, and I think that's a huge positive case study about how to, empower and enrich people's lives, post conviction or post prison back into society, really. You just have to, away from drugs just slightly, not sidestepping this, but you have to look at the marvelous work Timpsons do. There's such a great organization that trusts people. And there are parallels here throughout all walks of life in society. There was a message on Twitter that I followed this week from Jack Twigg, who'd just been released from prison a year ago, and he's just been made a manager of a store enabled through Timpsons, the Timpsons Academy and Foundation. And I think, that had, 100,000 retweets or likes or something. And it just shows you the public will to see people succeed when they've been, incarcerated or tripped up by, a wrongdoing. We shouldn't write people off. And it doesn't matter where you are, what walk of life you're from. But there are real inequities, vivid today, and I'll just give one example. Why do we police a royal event like Royal Ascot races? Completely different to another one. because the race goers are the same people, yet because one has what certain stigma attached to it and another doesn't, then they're policed completely different. And it's the same with different communities. You know, we over police different communities, as Brian and Niamh mentioned earlier on, and it's unintentionally to some degree, but it's over criminalizing different offences, and that's probably a subject, a webinar subject all on its own. But it happens. You know, we over police different communities terribly, and I saw a question flash up on the chat actually about Brixton, and it's you know, we have to learn, we have to listen to our communities, we have to learn all the time.
Okay, great, thank you very much, Jason. And now there's another question, the one I had actually briefed you to expect before I threw you a curve.
That's why I went off on a tangent.
No, that was great, thank you, and apologies for my indecisive questioning there. But so for the next one, we had a couple of questions about diversion schemes, but for cops who might test positive for drug use in their random testing. So do forces have a health diversion scheme? That asks Paul Story. And on the Q&A, we had quite a similar one. Who asked that? We also were asked, oh yeah, no, Paul Story put the same question there as well. So if you could say any thoughts you have in that direction.
It's a brilliant question, and it's something I definitely won't shy upon, because I'm speaking about this very thing currently actually with our professional standards department and human resources. It's something that's actually been left to last. You know, we've covered a diversion scheme for the public, but not forgetting that the police are the public are the police. However, there are certain expectations and standards expected of a police officer for integrity, clearly as one, and we've left this very subject right to the last thing, and we're actually currently talking about this now. So and it's probably to push a question back: would the public actually be happy seeing a police officer diverted as a member of the public for possession of drugs or a positive drug test? And it's something that I'd like to gain the public opinion back on, because it's really valid. You know, I'd certainly like to see a diversion opportunity rather than a sacking, but that it's about the public's expectation. Trust and confidence and legitimacy in police is absolutely crucial.
Okay, great, thank you, Jason. Now I'll move. I hope your call with the authorities went well enough, Brian, and all clear there.
I was just going to add to that, at least when I was in the police, which is some time ago now, there was a policy in the Metropolitan Police that if you had a drug problem, a drug addiction problem, and you went to occupational health with that problem, then it would be treated as a health issue. If you were caught with drugs, then it would be a professional standards issue.
Very interesting, thank you. And
that's the same. Yeah, just to concur, that's the policy as it is now. So if a police officer did have an issue with drugs or alcohol, then they would be supported if they declared that proactively. But yeah, being found in possession, it's a step too late, as it were. So that's where the diversion element comes into it.
Great, thank you. And I think one place I think not to be predictable is, firstly, surprisingly enough, there are no such tests for members of Parliament or even members of the House of Lords. I don't think, and I imagine that won't be voted in by members of either house anytime particularly soon. And we could only speculate how such news would be greeted if you did have positive tests. I know you can't comment on particular parties, but I'm sure we've all seen a video of a particular cabinet minister whose eyes are going absolutely all over the place in Parliament at one time. So I can only speculate what would happen if we had such tests. I'm going to ask...
James, can I just jump in there? It's a really great point that you raise about Parliament and the hypocrisy in all of this. And also the fact, and I absolutely think if someone presents with a drug problem to seek help, you should get support regardless of the occupation. But you're caught with the drug that's causing you the problem, and you're treated as a criminal, either as a policeman or Joe Public. But then we have all of the Tories who were up for leadership, I think bar one, who've admitted to their drug use. and who in no way had just the sheer humanity to reflect on the fact that they support a policy that had they been criminalized for, they would not be in the position they are today. So, I mean, it's the sheer hypocrisy of that as well. You know, everything from, and the constant kind of youthful indiscretion. And yet, when we look at who is being criminalized, it is our young people.
Hey, thank you. And actually, yeah, I'm going to get Brian to lead in on something more around that topic. So it's a question from Blaine Stoffard, which I think Brian went some way to answering earlier, but I guess I'm going to ask for if there's a little bit more on that. So previously you talked about roadblocks being really who are the likely voters for a party, who do they hope will vote for them, and then their drug policy will largely be geared towards that group. And so Blaine's question was kind of more about, do the politicians need convincing themselves? So I'll read the question. And so I noted the reference to public opinion, and I have also noticed how well informed, humane and grown up recent debates in parliaments have been at MP level. What strategies do panelists suggest to shift that level of thoughtfulness regarding drug policy reform to government levels? Should we also be looking at media stances? And so that's Blaine Stoffard from Drugs and Alcohol Today. So do you think, Brian, that politicians need convincing? Do you think they know what the right policy is, but they're scared of it because of the voters? Or do you think on all benches there are people who do really need an education in matters and should be sent a recording of this webinar, no less?
Yes. So I think there are people on all benches. I mean, I'm trying to, in my head, draw a Venn diagram here, but what you've got is you've got some politicians who are absolutely educated on these issues, know what the way to go is in terms of harm reduction, and are willing to take the political risk to come out as advocating that particular way of direction of travel, if you will. You've got others who completely understand all the very powerful arguments for decriminalisation, for treating it as a health issue, even for legalisation, but they feel that it's politically damaging to advocate it. So whilst they have they don't need to be convinced in terms of the science, they need to be convinced in terms of whether it would be politically damaging for them. And then, unfortunately, you have the dinosaurs who just do not understand. Well, they don't understand anything. They don't understand young people. They don't understand about people taking drugs. They just don't understand. And they don't want to understand. They just think that life is much more straightforward by saying drugs are illegal, they're dangerous, and people shouldn't take them, and we should lock up people who deal in them and people that use them. So, you know, you've got all of those different sorts of people in Parliament, and we need a majority to be able to get things through. And so we need to convince those people who understand, completely understand the science and the experience of systems of decriminalisation and legalisation. We need to convince them that it would not be politically damaging to them to advocate that approach. And, you know, dinosaurs sooner or later become extinct.
Awesome, thank you very much. And so I've got another question for you, Brian. Actually, I had a very spooky moment a minute ago where I was just trying to formulate a question in my mind, and then it just pinged up that Sepe Sahati put it into better words than I was ever going to manage. So does Brian believe politicians are more influenced by political lobbying or public opinion? And in addition, I'll add to that, is there lobbying from other groups, which would any cynic say that there are some other groups, perhaps, you know, commercial interests who would have a view on that, would you imagine, if you are allowed to go there? So anything to say on that?
Right, so this again is complicated. So, personally speaking, I tend not to listen to or engage with lobbyists. I try and understand what the public is. I try and understand what the science is. I try to take objective decisions. And it's all very well for me for two reasons. One, the political party that I belong to keeps me on a very long lead. So I'm allowed to say controversial things and not necessarily have the whip taken away from me. And yes, there are some lobbying groups, right-wing lobbying groups, right-wing Christian lobbying groups who on a whole range of things are not progressive, who wants to see things reversed, whether it's around trans issues, whether it's around gay marriage, whether it's around drugs. So you have got people lobbying on that. The important thing, the reason why you do need to pay attention to lobbyists and what they're doing and who they're funded by and that sort of thing is because they're also lobbying journalists. They're also lobbying in the public space in terms of online. So they're trying to convince people the reverse of what, a bit like anti-vaxxers. They're trying to convince people that the world is different from what it actually is in order to further their own views. So, that I don't know whether that answers the question, but
it does. Thank you very much. I'm absolutely ideal. So now I'll circle back to Jason. And so I'd asked Brian about whether politicians know enough about drugs and drug issues, how much they're obeying their knowledge or lack of, how much they're obeying the voters. Now I'll turn it back to the question of police and policing. So I would say that, as well as this, I'm a criminology lecturer. And so through that, I've met a number of police officers, some who've been generous enough to do guest lectures for me, who've come to previous events. I have some friends who are in police forces, and obviously we talk about drugs because it's my job and theirs. And I'm normally rather impressed with knowledge, attitudes, etc. But I imagine someone who's talked to more police officers about drugs than I have is probably Jason. So I don't know if you could give us anything more on if you think extra education knowledge is needed in the police, particularly perhaps how to go about it, and your overall take on that issue that I've just been outlining.
Yeah, that's a great question. To answer that, and then come back round. No, the police officers don't have enough knowledge generally, but it is impressive. So it's a continual program. It's and that's not to criticize my colleagues at all, because when you like, I take myself as an example here. So when I first joined the police, I did not know anything about drugs. I saw someone injecting heroin and I thought it was completely for fun, to get a high. Little did I know it's nothing to do with choice or fun or getting a sensation of a high. I never knew what extent. I've got Martin Blakeborough to thank very much. I think he's here actually, to thank for educating me on addiction and trauma way back 25 years ago. So that journey is a continual one. Police officers are becoming trauma informed, and this is the key here. So it's not just drugs and addiction. It's about ACEs. It's about childhood trauma. It's about trauma that occurs through PTSD in older years. It's recognizing that addiction can be a trigger for trauma set years ago or very suddenly. So it's about police officers becoming, understanding of someone's circumstances and the triggers for that addiction if we're talking about drugs. But it's not just about drugs. So being trauma informed now is being led primarily by the violence reduction units. You're also beginning to see on a much more wider strategic level great programs such as the heroin and crack action area coordinators, led by the Home Office or funded by the Home Office under the serious violence strategy, and primarily the coordinators are police officers, and they're working in partnership with public health, working through all of the layers of charity to drug services to a number of organisations to educate not just police officers, practitioners, but structures and partners and the public as a whole, destigmatising as we go along. There's also Project ADDA that I don't agree with everything that ADDA is, I have to say, but I do support much of what it is intended to do, and that's restrict supply and promote recovery. So the harm reduction element of ADDA is really impressive. You know, it's investing significant money and funding. It's about education and diversion. Diversion is in the ADDA title. Addiction, diversion, I can't remember all of it after I met, but and recovery. But it's there. That's a government strategy, and that's how we're moving that conversation forward. So it's not just about police officers, but more can be done. You know, education right at the beginning of someone's career is going to be absolutely valuable.
Awesome, thank you very, very much. So I think we're getting close to a point of moving through the, there's loads and loads of questions, and I've, to be honest, been regularly losing track. There's been so many really, really good questions. But I've actually got another one would like to ask to Niamh. So question says, alcohol, who is it who asked this one? Daniel Barker. Alcohol is a legal drug that causes significant problems for health, crime and disorder. How will decriminalisation or even legalisation of drugs be more successful than alcohol? And actually, to couple with that one, we had one question earlier I meant to ask but forgot about the difference between legalisation and decriminalisation. So perhaps if you could give a quick outline of that and then move on to how the outcomes might be better than our current alcohol regulation system.
Okay. I do first of all want to come back to Jason's point though about trauma-informed policing. And I do think that there is a challenge here is that police are often left to respond to the problem when it's occurred. And what I want to see is much more kind of social and health policies and funding that addresses problems or prevents problems from happening. And we know, for example, that addiction, that dependency is driven by trauma in the main and mental health problems. And in that much of that trauma is wrapped up in adverse childhood experiences, as Jason has said. I would like to see, that 1.6 billion I mentioned earlier that has no impact on the drug supply. I would like to see some of that funding being rolled back into schools to have counsellors, trauma-informed counselling from primary school age. Like if we started that, we would in the future change the landscape of what drug use looks like. Recreational drug use, I think, is here to stay, and we should have good public health responses and a legal market and everything. But trauma-informed policing is addressing the problem. Let's look at solutions to preventing those problems occurring. And in terms of legalization versus decriminalisation, decriminalisation is the non-criminal justice responses to possession offences, or legalisation of possession as Brian's described under the Psychoactive Substances Act. So it's where possession is not offence, but it does not deal with the market. And so the market is responsible for the supply and the production of drugs. And a regulated market, a legalized market, is one that regulates those activities. So there is licenses, there is product control, which again can reduce drug-related deaths, purity, part of the product control, clear advice on safer use. And then taking that into alcohol, I would say, the UK has a very specific, and Ireland has a very specific relationship with alcohol. I mean, there's some cultural explorations that I think that have to be explored. Tighter regulation may help reduce use, but I don't think that's the silver bullet. I think that is about a public health and education campaign. We've seen with tobacco, for example, how we've been really effective, not through a criminal justice response, but through public health messaging and education, how we reduce consumption. And I think there's a conversation we need to start having around safer use of alcohol. So I would like to see more of a public health response. Yes, there may be some stuff around regulations and availability in supermarket and minimum pricing, but I don't think that's the silver bullet to it. I think actually it's about having those conversations from a public health perspective and teaching people how to have a better relationship with alcohol. And that then feeds into how would we regulate drugs. First of all, I would say that the vast majority of drugs that we're talking about are less harmful than alcohol. And that's not just my opinion, that has been evidenced through the multi-criteria rationale of the harm that was produced by David Nutt. We're on a drug science broadcast, and others. I was lucky enough to be part of some of that work. And we know that alcohol is the most harmful, and then heroin and crack cocaine. But if we move down the list, you know, the harms associated with cannabis could be seriously mitigated around product control. The harms of psychedelics are very minimal. And one of the problems we have is we constantly talk about these drugs in the prism of harm and not about benefits. And because of a 100-year propaganda war, we are only now having those conversations about how these drugs that have been really difficult to research, really difficult to access, have real potential for medicinal benefits. And that's cannabis through the psychedelics, through MDMA. So some of the things that I think we have to do around engaging the public on this is to have a different conversation. You know, 100 years of the harm sort of narrative has led to the public feeling that these drugs are in some way super, super, super dangerous. They're toxic, they're lethal. I mean, most of these drugs come from plants. In fact, pretty much all of them come from plants. So again, I think it's about how we frame this. And I would like more conversations about the positives and the pleasure and all of the things that actually, the real life experience that people have with drugs and the real life developments that we're seeing with the like psychedelics and the cannabis medicinal products.
Thank you. And you actually, whether deliberately or not, you did the perfect lead into my next question. So thank you much. And I think Jason has already volunteered to take these questions about the school drug education. Something that as a criminology lecturer, I do modules on drugs, and you always have one on, I do one on school drugs education. I must admit that having read the literature, it looks like it's certainly contested. And it's difficult to make an ideal drugs education. It's difficult to first decide what you want the outcome to be. It's difficult to measure what the outcome is. I think that's the same for media information as it is for school education. So we've got one question in short form. So I've got to where we got from Claire, I think. So drug education has only been reinstated to PSHE in September 2020 after a 10-year gap. We had a little bit of it when I was at school. We got visited by a police officer at school. We heard about it then. That was TV. That was I'm from Reading, so that was Thames Valley Police in the 1990s. Did that. So after a 10-year gap, no wonder we have a generation of young people who are naive or ignorant about associated harms. Then we have Steve Clare. Many teachers I know feel uncomfortable delivering PSHE. I'm an external speaker, teacher supporting secondary schools with alcohol and other drug harm reduction lessons, engaging in honest, pragmatic talking to students, not at them. I should also, one small bit of personal experience as well, when I was a volunteer harm reduction worker with Inroads Street Drugs Project in Cardiff, on a couple of occasions I helped out with school drugs education. I thought we were giving out quite good, I thought progressive, although maybe slightly risque drugs harm reduction advice. You know, the look on the face of one teacher once who wasn't expecting us to say that. Anyway, so Jason, could you please lead and say any views you have on the school drugs education questions?
Yeah, I mean, this is the greatest question of the day, I think, because this is where it's at. Everything we're talking about today, you know, diversion, decriminalisation, is all about education. And what a better opportunity to educate people than in school. And I think but it's about the quality. It's about who delivers that. A police officer isn't the right person to deliver drugs education. No way. You know, we're the wrong person. We have limited knowledge. We have one side of knowledge. Notwithstanding, there'll be some brilliant educators out there within policing, but we can educate on the law and people's rights about being stopped and searched. However, we're not the right people. And I totally reflect and accept that comment about teachers not being too comfortable with delivering drugs education for the same reasons. There are, however, some brilliant organisations out there, such as Crew, such as The Loop, such as some of the material produced by, I'm not going to name everyone, but the larger, drug services, We Are With You have a brilliant package with young people and over 50s on alcohol. So there are great packages out there available for harm reduction and education. But I'm really proud, actually, because we've been working in collaboration with Crew and The Loop and the PSHE Association to build upon the work already done with Professor Harry Sumnall and the PSHE about drugs education in schools. So there's some very current, very credible education available. And under the violence reduction units, there's the ability to network within different schools. And there's a point you made earlier on about schools. Schools have very different socio-economic communities, and they all have to be approached completely differently, respecting that group. But drugs and education is the same. Everyone enters the same illicit market. So we need to prepare. One area of concern that I have, linked to both really, is the transition year 6 into secondary year 7, and preparing young people as best as we possibly can for secondary school life, particularly because the availability of new CBD products and cannabis edibles and gummies and synthetics is on the increase, and the variety is ever widening. We don't want those drugs over criminalized or over controlled. We want the education to be greater and more accessible, but we need greater education. So diversion, one area that I'm very, very proud of within Thames Valley is drug diversion in schools. So now we're enabling our framework or our model for diversion to be adopted by schools. So if a teacher finds a student in possession, no longer does that student have to be excluded. The diversion model can take part, and the drug service come into the school and deliver the education. That's it. No involvement at all for police, other than the recording of the crime so far we've got. But outcome 22 provides a depenalised outcome as a result. So there's a method, there's a model already in existence. And there's some great educators out there, but any school's education needs to be credible and well delivered. Otherwise, it could cause more harm than it intended.
Thank you. So, Brian, I don't know if you have any follow-up on the education question. So if you do, great. If not, I actually have another question for you. So I don't know if you want to take the potluck question or you have more to say on the education question.
The only thing I say about education is that the most important thing is that the person that delivers the education has to be credible in the eyes of the audience. And that will differ depending on the socioeconomics of the people in the classroom. Yes, okay, somebody suggested in the chat that a recovering addict would be the best person to deliver that. Well, in terms of the dangers of addiction, that might be the case. But somebody who uses drugs recreationally, controversially, might be somebody who can say, look, I take drugs as long as you're sensible about it. But that might raise eyebrows from the teacher in the room if somebody did say that. Somebody's also said, well, hang on a minute, you're talking about decriminalisation, legalisation of drugs. We've seen the problem that alcohol causes. I mean, as Niamh said, the problem with alcohol is people with who have addictive personalities, who've had trauma in their lives in the past, and alcohol is used in order to try and deal with those experiences, self-medication, if you like. And some people use alcohol to self-medicate. Some people will switch from alcohol to using another sort of drug to self-medicate if drugs become decriminalised. And you've got to look at the relative harm. What do these substances do to people's bodies? What do these substances do to people's minds? You know, alcohol is a depressant as well as a stimulant. MDMA is a stimulant, but it's an upper as well. So, you know, you could argue, I wouldn't dare, you could argue MDMA is a much better drug than alcohol. I think we'll change the subject there. What was the other question?
So the other question, it's actually quite a long one, but I like it. So I think we're going to start to tie up with a couple more themes where we'll kind of run through. And this one is the devil in the detail question. It's quite long, but I like it, so I'm going to read it. So it's the problem with many discussions about legalization is the devil in the detail, which is rarely discussed. And I agree, many people are kind of, it's all fine, legalized, don't worry, it's all good. So now I'm going to see if I can press any of you on some details of maybe how a radically changed drug policy might look like. So would there be an age limit if it remains illegal prohibited for under 18s? Does that mean all organised crime gangs can only target under 18s? Do we dissuade anyone from using substances? If a woman is 8 months pregnant and wants to try injecting heroin, can she? What about the workplace? Train drivers, crane operators, drugs in the system, police officers, paramedics? If there is a legal limit, how is it policed? It's far more complex than alcohol and breath tests. If it is accepted, legalization may be better than the current system. None of those issues seem properly discussed. I'm sure we don't have, I mean, that's an entire webinar on those issues highlighted. I don't know if you've got any kind of pragmatic thoughts on any of those raised you would like to go into.
Well, all I would say is, well, what do we do with alcohol? We try to prevent young people under 18 from consuming alcohol. We would use a similar approach in terms of preventing young people from taking drugs. If your airline pilot or your surgeon turn up drunk at work, people would take a pretty dim view of it, and similar would apply as far as drugs are concerned. Clearly, we're talking about a variety of substances as opposed to alcohol being one substance, and therefore educating people in terms of what happens if I take this and in what quantity is more complex. And people who take a paternalistic view of life would say, oh, well, people aren't intelligent enough to be able to make those difficult decisions, so we should just ban all of them. If that's your view, that's your view. It's not my view.
Thank you. And on the topic of drugs while at work, I have actually just opened a beer, but it is 8:30 in my time zone, so I think I'm allowed to at this point. But I would also see if Niamh or Jason have anything to add on the David Ellison question, or maybe any of the kind of the bigger issues about a more radical drug policy change.
Okay, just a quick, I'll pick up on a couple of the other ones. I completely agree with Brian. You do it the same as you do alcohol, you know, apart from different regulations in place. In terms of availability, I should explain that. So you wouldn't necessarily have a range of psychedelic substances at Sainsbury's. We currently do have a range of drugs at Sainsbury's. So, you know, maybe there's a broader conversation about that. But I think in terms of how we deal with it, you know, the idea that organised crime gangs are going to target under 18s, that's not a big market. There's no money in that. That's just not going to happen. Do we dissuade anyone from using a substance? Well, in the same way we do around public health risks. You know, if it is risky use, what we want to do is provide a supportive, health-driven environment to help that person make better decisions. If someone is using, we give them harm reduction advice. How do you use as safely as possible? Agree on the workplace approach completely. But I think for me, the legalization model has to be kind of like, we make sure that decriminalisation is part of it. Otherwise, we are continue to criminalising folks who are accessing from illicit markets, the same way that we do with alcohol and tobacco possession of you know, the counterfeit or duty non-tax paying types of alcohol and tobacco are not possession offences. So we just take away that from all of the market. And then when we look at regulation, like how do we make regulation that socially responsible kind of framework that we're seeing happening in the US that I described earlier? Oh, and the pregnant one, because that's the tricky one. I like a wicked question. Pregnancy. You mean, again, you know, if an 8 months pregnant woman is drinking a bottle of wine, we go in and we provide support. We do it from a safeguarding perspective. Interestingly enough, I just say this about heroin. Everybody, you know, it's the route of administration with heroin that is the most harmful. That's what causes the harm to people, either through blood-borne viruses or through injecting sight problems. The drug itself actually doesn't cause any harm to the system. So it doesn't cause liver damage, it doesn't cause lung damage, it doesn't cause these things that alcohol and tobacco cause. So actually, in many ways, we should start to have a more honest conversation about heroin. And final point, a regulated market for drugs. We, again, focus it on the drugs that currently exist. Those are the drugs that are the products of prohibition. We would want to have a wider range of substances. So if we look at heroin, heroin comes from poppy, opium tea. So we'd be looking at everything from opium tea to the medical prescribing of diamorphine, which is the pharmaceutical form of heroin. We would have an ability to create a market that encouraged through taxation and through public health messaging, use of sort of less harmful-ish substance than the substance that has come out of prohibition itself.
Great, thank you. And so I will pass on to Jason, but while I'm doing that, I think really should wrap up soon. So I will say, while I'm asking if Jason has any more on that, maybe if Brian and Niamh look through, if you see any questions you really want to have a bite into, then get them ready and let me know once Jason has spoken. Otherwise, I will probably begin the wrapping up procedure after we have heard from Jason again.
Thank you. Just to echo the points that Niamh and Brian have made already, really, I think, you know, regulation or legalization is a, you know, is a learning environment. You know, we can look to where it's successful across the world, you know, look at the strong evidence bases and adopt accordingly. I think my only, and it's probably more personal than anything else, but only through my experience as a police officer, you know, any regulated model should be a health policy, a health-driven one, and not one for profit. You know, you cannot have profit driving, you know, a health intervention, if that makes sense. And yes, I totally acknowledge that there will be a market for under 18s. You know, how can any state sell a substance, a controlled substance, if you like, to an under 18-year-old? It's going to happen, but then that market is there already. So we need to make things safer, but look at the evidence elsewhere. And perhaps we could look at the evidence from Canada, who are manipulating the pricing, I believe, to try and limit the strength of THC, or the THC strength of cannabis, to the illicit under 18 market, and ways to manipulate the market in other ways. And that's the evidence that we need to look at. I think you know, this is a learning process. No single person or entity has all the answers here. This is about the experts coming together with differing views. We might agree, we might disagree, but we need to certainly progress and change. And that's why we're talking about this today, with so many different views.
Great stuff. So thank you, Jason. So any closing comments from Brian or Niamh while we are still here?
The only thing I would say is that, yes, the devil is in the detail. It is a complex issue, whether it's decriminalisation or legalisation. But we need to start the process. We need to start the conversation. We need to start exploring the possibility, as opposed to the situation that we're in at the moment, where there is a political roadblock to progress.
Thank you. And Niamh?
I just really like the last few questions about the openness and talking to young people about drug use. And just to agree with Jason, like, I think if kids can get hold of alcohol, but that's from the legal market. So it would be probably the legal market that would be providing it. But this idea of openness, you know, and I'm just going to share an anecdotal story. My stepdaughter came home. This is many, many, many years ago. My stepdaughter came home and she had, you know, puffy lips, and she had clearly taken some MDMA. And I have experience of that. I was at, you know, 1990s Northern Ireland. It was what the kids did then. You know, I have an argument that it helped with the police process. And essentially, I had a conversation with her, and it was not in any way judgmental. I was just like, I want you to be safe. And if anything happens to you, I want you to ring me. I want you to feel safe enough to ring me. I won't be angry. And that's what I think the problem with our current drug policy is. It creates an environment that encourages more harms, not less harms. And that's what, across the education piece, across the legalization piece, the decrim piece, it's about creating policies that reduce harm and that make people feel safe and secure, and that ultimately, reduces risk of death, risk of ambulance call out, risk of police call out. So that's kind of what I would like to see.
Can I just come back on something that I saw in one of the questions, which was around the number of drug deaths from legal highs, from new psychoactive substances. A lot of people took new psychoactive substances, legal highs, because they were legal. Because they thought that they would not get into trouble if they took them, as opposed to drugs that were under the Misuse of Drugs Act. As soon as you criminalize the new psychoactive substances, people say, well, there's no point in taking new psychoactive substances because the penalty is going to be the same whether you take that, whether you take a controlled drug. So I might as well take the real thing rather than the synthetic alternative. I think I don't know for a fact, but I would have thought that lays behind a lot of the statistics around the reduction in deaths from people taking new psychoactive substances.